Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. February 23, 1945. Hill 362, Iwo Jima. Imagine it. The volcanic ash stings your eyes, the air tastes of sulfur and smoke, and every breath feels borrowed. Through the haze, a lone figure crawls forward, Corporal Herschel Woody Williams. On his back, 70 pounds of steel, fuel, and compressed gas a load that could mean life or death. Around him lies silence broken only by the crack of gunfire. His demolition unit gone. 6 men dead or 2 wounded to move. Only 4 riflemen remain, laying down covering fire as Williams inches toward a concrete pillbox that had already broken the advance of 3 entire Marine companies. Inside, his pack waits destruction. 4 gallons of a deadly mixture diesel and high-octane aviation fuel. He knows what that means. 7 seconds. That's all he has. 7 seconds to pull the trigger, to unleash a stream of living fire, to expose himself utterly. 7 seconds, where the glowing orange arc of his flame would mark him as the perfect target for Japanese machine guns. 7 seconds, the cruelest arithmetic of war. Statistically, he shouldn't live to see the 8th. Military analysts later noted that a flamethrower operator's average survival time in combat was roughly twice that 14 seconds. Cold numbers for warm blood. On Iwo Jima, those odds grew worse. One entire flamethrower battalion suffered a 92% casualty rate. Not wounded. Casualties, men dead, missing, or so grievously burned and broken that they would never again shoulder a weapon. This is the story of America's most fearsome weapon and its most fatal assignment. It's the tale of men who carried fire itself into battle, knowing full well that their chances of returning were slimmer than anyone else's on the bloodiest battlefield in the history of the Marine Corps. At first glance, the weapon seemed almost rudimentary. The M2 flamethrower, introduced in 1944, was little more than 3 cylinders strapped together, a crude-looking backpack of death. 2 of the tanks held the fuel, that precise mixture of diesel and aviation gasoline engineered to burn longer, hotter, and more persistently than regular gas. Between them sat a smaller tank, pressurized with nitrogen gas. That was the heart, the force that would drive the fuel out at a staggering 300 pounds per square inch. A flexible hose snaked from the pack to a firing wand, a metal tube that looked almost innocent until you saw its twin triggers. The rear one released the nitrogen pressure, forcing the fuel forward. The front one sparked life. 5 ignition cartridges arranged in a revolver-style chamber, ensuring that even in the chaos of battle, the weapon would breathe fire when commanded. Fully loaded, the M2 weighed 70 pounds, nearly half a man's body weight. Its effective reach? Around 20 meters. In perfect conditions, perhaps 40. But nothing about Iwo Jima was perfect. The ash, the heat, the chaos, everything conspired to shorten those odds. Total burn time, 7 to 8 seconds. That's it. Operators learned fast to fire in quick, savage bursts, conserving fuel the way a drowning man clings to air. Each second devoured half a gallon, unleashing a seething, rolling fireball that could pour into cave mouths, flood tunnels, and strip oxygen from the very air. The flamethrower didn't just burn, it suffocated. It turned bunkers into ovens, consuming the air before the bodies, leaving behind silence and charred stone. Death came not always from flame, but from the absence of breath. And yet men volunteered. They strapped on those tanks willingly. Perhaps they were brave. Perhaps they were simply young and believed themselves immortal. Private First Class Joseph Ribakiewicz was one of them. He had enlisted In 1942, his heart filled with patriotism after Pearl Harbor, his imagination fired by the tales of Guadalcanal's heroes. He would learn soon enough what it meant to carry fire into hell. After completing boot camp at Parris Island, Private First Class Joseph Rybakiewicz stood at a crossroads. He could have stayed safely stateside, guarding the naval base in New London, Connecticut, for the remainder of the war. No one would have judged him for it. But then, what young Marine could resist the pull of the Pacific? The whispered tales from returning veterans, the stories of brotherhood and fury, of jungles and black sands where honor was tested. Hearing those voices, Rybakiewicz made his choice. He asked for combat duty. His request sent him to Camp Lejeune in July 1944, to a place of relentless discipline, the Demolition and Flamethrower School. There, training wasn't merely hard. It was punishing, technical, and merciless. The instructors drilled their men in every nuance of the M2 flamethrower's anatomy. How to prime the ignition system without misfire, how to maintain proper nitrogen pressure, how to sniff out a fuel leak before it turned the operator into a walking inferno. They learned to fire from a stance as deliberate as a marksman's prayer, leaning forward to counter the recoil when compressed nitrogen roared through the system. Woody Williams would later recall those lessons with a grim smile. He couldn't count the number of times he'd singed away his own eyebrows and arm hair before mastering the weapon's temper. The M2 had a vicious kick, failed to brace, and its barrel would jerk skyward, raining liquid fire down on the man who held it. Williams once saw the consequence firsthand. A desperate Marine, untrained, picking up a fallen flamethrower and pulling the trigger without proper stance. In a heartbeat, he was engulfed, gone in a burst of his own fire. But mechanics were only the first layer of survival. The real mastery lay in tactics, in learning how to live long enough to reach the target. Recruits trained to work in close coordination with rifle squads, advancing toward pillboxes and bunkers under covering fire. The doctrine was clear. Flamethrower operators never fought alone. A proper team numbered between 4 and 6 men, the operator himself. An assistant lugging spare fuel tanks and ignition cartridges, and at least 2 riflemen armed with Browning automatic rifles to suppress enemy fire. The rifleman's job was to pin Japanese defenders, giving the operator the briefest window to close in and strike. The assistant's duty was to reload or to take the weapon if the operator fell. In theory, it was a sound, calculated system. In practice on Iwo Jima, it unraveled fast. Both Corporal Williams and Private Rybakiewicz would soon learn that the battle unfolding on that island wasn't shaped by American ingenuity, but by Japanese resolve, by one man's ruthless vision. His name was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Kuribayashi was no ordinary commander, a samurai descendant, a man of stern discipline and sharp intellect. He had once walked the streets of Texas, training with U.S. cavalry at Fort Bliss in the 1920s. Unlike many of his peers who dismissed Americans as soft and complacent, Kuribayashi had seen their factories, their machines, their restless energy. He knew better. In a letter to his wife, written years before the war, he had warned, "The United States is the last country Japan should ever fight." He described America's industrial power as huge and fabulous, its people as energetic and adaptable. So when Prime Minister Hideki Tojo assigned him in May 1944 to defend Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi accepted with full awareness of what awaited him. He could not win, but he could bleed his enemy so badly that victory itself would come to feel like defeat. Arriving on the island in June 1944, he began reshaping it into a fortress, unlike anything seen in the Pacific. He defied Japan's own military orthodoxy. There would be no suicidal charges, no futile beach defenses. Instead, he would let the Americans land unhindered and then bury them in fire and stone. Every enemy position would have to be rooted out, one by one. His strategy was devastatingly simple. Inflict maximum casualties through interlocking fields of fire, concealed artillery, and a defense in depth so intricate that not even weeks of naval bombardment could crush it. To realize his vision, Kuribayashi mobilized all 23,000 soldiers on the island, devoting a full quarter of his force to engineering and tunneling. They carved an empire beneath the ground. Mining engineers from Japan oversaw the work, turning volcanic rock-soft pumice and layers of hard basalt into passageways of war. Where picks failed, they used explosives and pneumatic drills. 8 months later, Iwo Jima had become a labyrinth. Over 11 miles of tunnels wound beneath its blackened soil, some descending as deep as 75 feet. There were vast chambers that could house 300 to 400 men, serving as barracks, command posts, or supply depots stocked with ammunition, food, and water. Smaller caves dotted the system, tight, suffocating alcoves where only 2 or 3 soldiers could fit, waiting in silence, surrounded by the stone womb of Kuribayashi's creation. A fortress beneath the earth, built to defy annihilation. The tunnel's Kuribayashi's veins of stone stitched the island together in a hidden web of war. Imagine it. A soldier could vanish beneath the earth at one end of Iwo Jima and emerge hundreds of yards away, unseen by American eyes. These subterranean arteries allowed Japanese troops to reinforce faltering positions, to retreat without being cornered, to reoccupy ground the Marines believed secure. What the Americans thought was conquered soil was often alive beneath their boots. Ventilation shafts snaked upward, channeling air through the choking fumes of sulfur that seeped from the volcanic rock. Engineers worked tirelessly to keep those passageways breathable, adjusting airflows, reinforcing openings, and constructing multiple exits so that no unit could be buried alive by a single shell. Deep beneath the surface, the Nanpo bunker, the naval headquarters, lay 90 feet underground, stocked with enough supplies to last 3 months of siege. And above ground, a nightmare in concrete. Kuribayashi's engineers built more than 600 pillboxes and blockhouses, each one a miniature fortress of reinforced concrete with 4-foot-thick walls, impervious to all but a direct strike from a battleship gun. These weren't the rough makeshift defenses seen on other islands. They were masterpieces of fortification, linked to one another, so that every position could defend its neighbor. Marines advancing on one pillbox would suddenly find themselves flanked by withering fire from 2 or 3 others. Every loophole, every firing slit was placed with mathematical precision. Machine gunners could pour bullets through narrow openings while remaining virtually invisible and nearly invulnerable. The Japanese cloaked their fortifications with volcanic ash and sparse vegetation, blending them seamlessly into the black landscape. The positions revealed themselves only when they came alive with fire. From the beaches to the airfields, from ravines to ridgelines, Kuribayashi's men positioned weapons to dominate every possible approach. His arsenal was staggering. 300 anti-aircraft guns, 120 naval guns ranging from 7 to 6 inches, 438 artillery pieces, 69 anti-tank guns, and 23 tanks embedded in the defenses like steel predators waiting to strike. They hoarded 22 million rounds of small-caliber ammunition. Snipers hid in hundreds of nests, and camouflaged machine gun teams covered nearly every square yard of the island. Then there were the monsters, the 300 Tilapia spigot mortars. Their enormous shells rose high into the air, then plunged down with terrifying force, turning entire Marine squads into vaporized silence. Kuribayashi's genius lay in the totality of his design. No part of Iwo Jima escaped the reach of Japanese fire. There would be no safe ground. Yet for all its horror, the island's value was coldly strategic. Iwo Jima, barely 8 square miles of volcanic desolation, was the pivot point between two worlds midway between the Mariana Islands and Tokyo, roughly 750 miles from each. To the Japanese, it was a watchtower, a forward warning post that radioed alerts of incoming B-29 formations, giving mainland defenses precious minutes to prepare. Fighters based on Iwo rose to harass those bombers, forcing them to jettison loads or limp home damaged. To the Americans, the calculus was equally clear. Capture Iwo Jima, and the enemy would lose his eyes and claws. The island would become a vital refueling and emergency landing site for crippled bombers, and a forward base from which fighter escorts could protect the B-29s all the way to Japan's heartland. The logic was impeccable, the price unimaginable. By September 1944, the planning began. The operation was given a deceptively simple name, Operation Detachment, a name that revealed nothing of the inferno to come. Picture the scene. The sea spits you onto foreign rock. The sky is a cold, leaden sheet, and somewhere beyond the surf, 100 hidden guns wait. The assault force was overwhelmingly American on paper. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, roughly 70,000 Marines, plus organic Navy personnel backed by the largest Pacific Armada yet assembled, nearly 450 ships, including 12 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, and a host of cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels. You can almost feel the scale, steel and canvas and diesel, an armada meant to sweep an island clean. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commander of the 5th Amphibious Corps, read the map of trouble clearly. Intelligence officers had pored over aerial photos and replayed lessons from earlier island fights. Smith asked, how bluntly, for time 10 consecutive days of naval pounding to soften what lay inland. He received only 3, a political and operational compromise driven by Admiral Nimitz's tight timetable for the next operation, Okinawa. The preliminary bombardment began on February 16, 1945. For 3 days, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers deluged Iwo Jima with shells, while carrier planes strafed and bombed map targets. It was a thunderous, cinematic display. It was also, tragically, mostly useless. Why? Because Kuribayashi had not built a surface toy to be knocked down. He had carved a subterranean citadel. The reinforced concrete pillboxes shrugged off most punishment unless struck by the heaviest naval guns. The underground galleries were simply untouched by shells from above. The very craters the bombardment made became havens for defenders and hurdles for attackers. Camouflaged positions survived the onslaught unseen. American observers, watching from high and far, missed countless lethal emplacements. Then came February 19, 1945. Dawn was gray and cold. At Ohor 900 hours, the first waves boomed ashore on the island's southeastern beaches. Immediately, the Marines met a surprise of geography rather than enemy fire. The sand was not sand at all, but volcanic, ash, soft gray pumice, forming steep terraces where boots found no purchase. Imagine taking a step and sinking to the ankle, then the knee. Tracked vehicles clogged and stalled. Tanks fought to clamber up 15-foot terraces of collapsing ash. Men tried to dig foxholes, only to have the loose pumice tumble back into the cavity they'd scraped. The volcanic dust invaded everything, guns, motors, lungs-grinding equipment, toward failure. For the first hour, oddly, the Japanese stayed silent. It was not mercy. It was design. Kuribayashi's plan unfurled with the cold patience of a hunter. He allowed the Marines to land, to struggle, to pile up in the narrow landing zones. As follow-on waves thudded in, the beach turned into a crowded pocket of trap. When roughly 30,000 Marines were ashore, packed into a beachhead only about 1,000 yards deep, the island erupted. Artillery, mortars, and machine guns detonated in unison from positions across the terrain. Mount Suribachi, the volcanic cone dominating the south, became a hellish fountain of concentrated fire as dozens of hidden emplacements spat lead and shrapnel. The northern high ground, bristling with artillery, poured shell fire down into the clogged approaches. In the first hour of sustained bombardment, Marines fell by the hundreds. The very ground that had slowed them now became a killing field, too soft to dig into for cover, too treacherous to sprint across. Tracked vehicles and tanks, the instruments meant to break a stalemate, were compromised, some knocked out before they could maneuver, others bogged and sat as immobile targets. Private First Class James Norton of the 3rd Battalion, 28th Marines, 5th Division, later recalled the approach in a single haunted image. No one spoke as they neared the beach. God only knew what waited ahead. Those optimistic intelligence forecasts of light resistance and a quick victory dissolved into ash and smoke within hours. By nightfall on D-Day, the Marines had managed to carve out only precarious footholds and paid dearly for them. Over 519 killed in action and more than 2,400 total casualties. And that was only the opening chapter. What lay ahead would be 5 weeks of ceaseless, merciless close quarters, fighting the most savage the Corps had ever known. Flamethrower teams came in with the initial landings, though few were pushed forward on D-Day itself. The early priority was securing the beachhead and expanding inland. By D+2, February 21st, however, it had become painfully obvious. Conventional arms artillery, armor, small arms were insufficient against the depth and craft of the Japanese works. Pillboxes survived, tunnels sheltered entire companies, and infantry attacks without specialized tools bled men by the score. The Marines needed demolition experts and the men who carried flame. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams landed on February 21st with the 3rd Marine Division. His rank read Demolition Sergeant, but his principal instrument of war was the M2 flamethrower. He led a 6-man flamethrower demolition unit specialist trained to move in close, to breach and burn hardened positions, with a terrifying mix of explosives and liquid fire. Their task was surgical and savage: approach what seemed impregnable, deliver concentrated destruction, and, if possible, come back alive. By the time Corporal Herschel Woody Williams set foot on Iwo Jima, he was no novice. He had already faced fire on Guam, where he'd learned through flame, sweat, and terror what his weapon could truly do. There he discovered both the power and the peril of the M2 flamethrower, how it could crack open the hardest Japanese fortifications, and how quickly it could turn its wielder into a walking pyre. But Guam, for all its ferocity, was only a prelude. Nothing in that earlier crucible could prepare him for Iwo. In doctrine, the flamethrower's use was textbook simplicity. When Marines struck an obstacle, a pillbox, a bunker, a cave mouth, they would call up a flamethrower team. Riflemen armed with M1 Garands and Browning automatic rifles would open up, showering the target with suppressing fire to keep the defenders' heads down. Under that thin veil of cover, the flamethrower operator and his assistant would crawl forward, closing the gap until the target loomed within 20 meters, the weapon's maximum effective reach. Then came the ignition, a jet of living fire hurled into the darkness, flooding the target's interior until no movement remained. On Iwo Jima, however, theory disintegrated the moment boots hit the ash. The Japanese defensive network made textbook tactics suicidal. Every pillbox was shielded by another, every cave covered by overlapping lines of fire. To suppress one position was to invite death from 3 others. Snipers perched in the heights watched for a single telltale sign, the bright orange lance of a flamethrower's ignition. Once that glow erupted, the operator's fate was nearly sealed. The M2 was both weapon and shackle. Its 70-pound bulk and the stiff hose tethering man to fire left little room for movement. While firing, the operator was nearly motionless, an easy target outlined by his own inferno. And though the tanks on his back were steel, strong enough to resist small arms fire, they were not invincible. A hit from a larger caliber round or a fragment from an artillery burst could puncture them. The nitrogen cylinder, pressurized to 300 pounds per square inch, might rupture under concussion or shrapnel. If that happened while firing, the blowback could tear the weapon apart. Worse still, if a fuel tank was breached while the flame was active, the operator would ignite instantly, engulfed in the very element he commanded. The Japanese knew this all too well. They aimed for the tanks. They watched for the spark. To them, the man with the flamethrower was death incarnate, and they responded with a fanatic's precision. For the operators, surrender was never an option. No Japanese soldier expected mercy from fire, nor offered it in return. Seeing a flamethrower approach, they fought like men already dead, charging with bayonets, waiting until the operator stood fully exposed, then unleashing everything they had. On February 23, 1945, 4 days into the battle, Woody Williams faced the nightmare that every flamethrower operator dreaded. His company had been halted on one of the island's 2 airfields, pinned down by interlocking fire from multiple Japanese pillboxes. 3 Marine companies had already tried to cross that open killing ground and failed, leaving behind a trail of bodies. Tanks that attempted to support the advance had been destroyed or driven back by Japanese anti-tank guns and artillery. The battalion commander gathered what remained of his men in the shelter of a shell crater. There, amid the roar of guns and the stench of burning fuel, he turned to Williams, the last operational demolition and flamethrower expert, and asked if he could do it. Could he take out the pillboxes? Williams knew the answer. He knew the odds, too. Every other member of his 6-man flamethrower unit was dead or wounded. He would have to go alone. But without those pillboxes silenced, his company would remain trapped, hemmed in by machine gun and artillery fire, unable to advance or withdraw. He chose 4 riflemen to cover him. It was a suicide pact unspoken. Their job was to keep the enemy's guns occupied long enough for Williams to crawl close enough to burn them out. 2 of those 4 men would not live to see sunset. What followed became legend, immortalized in his Medal of Honor citation as 4 hours of the most conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Williams crawled forward, the 70-pound flamethrower dragging through volcanic ash that clung to his uniform and scorched his lungs. Machine gun bullets clanged and whined off his tanks, but the steel held. At 25 yards, he unleashed a torrent of fire into the first pillbox, the opening blossoming into a roaring ball of orange. Silence followed. 1 position down. He moved to the next. A thin wisp of smoke betrayed a hidden vent in the roof. Climbing atop the fortification, he jammed the nozzle into the opening and fired, turning the bunker into an oven. He repeated this again and again, 5 times retreating to his own lines for more fuel and ignition cartridges, 5 times crawling back through open ground under fire. Once, a squad of Japanese soldiers rushed him with bayonets. They got within a few yards. Williams turned, fired point blank, and the charging men vanished in flame and smoke, consumed not only by fire but by the suffocating vacuum that followed. Oxygen devoured faster than breath could fill lungs. At another moment, surrounded by fire from 3 directions, he had no choice but forward. To stop was to die. His riflemen, first 4, then 3, then 2, kept up a desperate storm of cover and fire, thinning as one after another fell. When the day finally surrendered to dusk, Williams had single-handedly destroyed 7 major pillboxes, each one a fortress that had halted entire Marine companies. He had gone through dozens of gallons of fuel, suffered wounds that earned him a Purple Heart, and survived what should have been certain death. He had shown, in living flame, why the flamethrower operator, though facing a 92% casualty rate, was among the most feared and indispensable warriors on Iwo Jima, and he was not alone in his ordeal. Private First Class Joseph Rybakiewicz carried the same burden, the same 70 pounds of steel and Fear 90, including his gear, when he hit the beach on February 21st. Seasick, he stumbled ashore, fell face first into the volcanic ash, and vomited before he even raised his weapon. Then he fought. For 30 days, Rybakiewicz faced the same inferno Williams had. He destroyed 7 pillboxes and caves, each one a separate battle of terror and precision, of fire met by counterfire. On March 8th, his unit moved through a narrow gully, a claustrophobic chute of rock and smoke. Above them, a pillbox waited. Before the Marines could withdraw, the machine guns opened up. 4 men were cut down instantly. 5 more were wounded. The survivors, choking on dust and rage, could only press forward, knowing that for flamethrower men like Rybakiewicz, there was never any retreat, only the next target and the next breath of fire. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the narrow gully, rock walls pressing in, the air thick with ash and reek, and the echo of gunfire ricocheting like a death knell. That is where Private First Class Joseph Rybakiewicz found himself after the March ambush. He dragged 2 wounded men out of the churned-up earth and somehow carried them back to the aid station while shells sang overhead. A grenade's blast had showered his knuckles with shrapnel little crescent scars that he brushed off as insignificant and stubborn as iron. He went straight back into the fight. Can you feel that mix of exhaustion and furious instinct? Rybakiewicz, bandaged and shaken, asked a nearby Browning automatic rifle gunner for covering fire, and, with a steadiness born of anger at friends lost in the narrow chute, advanced on the pillbox. He later described what he did next in blunt, brutal terms. He gave it a long squirt and watched the interior burn to silence. Only the following day would a physician inspect his bloody hand and order him evacuated long enough for treatment. After stitches and a wrapped hand, he returned to the front lines, an admission, he said, to being terrified, not of death alone, but of the grim knowledge that he would go back into the same furnace again and again until either he or the battle ended it for him. Why were flamethrower operators so often lost to the island? The reasons form a cruel arithmetic, a chain of vulnerabilities that, when combined, made survival a slim and fading probability. Consider these elements together: proximity to the target. To be effective, an operator had to come within 20 meters of a bunker or cave mouth. At that range, even an average marksman could find his mark. Conspicuousness in use. The orange tongue of flame and the pall of smoke announced the operator's location to anyone within sight. Even when silent, The silhouette of the fuel-laden backpack marked him as the man to shoot. Limited fire endurance. 7 to 8 seconds of burn time meant each operator was forced to fire multiple short bursts to neutralize a position. Each burst another painted moment under the enemy's sights. Mobility penalty. While a rifleman could sprint and dive for cover, the man with 70 pounds of steel could not. The hose tethered him. The weight unbalanced him. He could not throw himself prone without risking his weapon. He had to advance deliberately, an exposed statue compared to the nimble infantryman. Psychological targeting. Japanese defenders hated the flamethrower. They knew it spelled a death worse than bullets, heat, smoke, suffocation. So they concentrated fire on its carriers and fought with the desperation of men facing immolation, the arithmetic of attrition. Each mission carried about the same level of risk. The odds against survival compounded with every mission until over weeks and dozens of engagements, the chance of being hit neared inevitability. The statisticians who calculated that average combat lifespan of 4 minutes were counting the cumulative exposure across many sorties, not a single bout. Friendly fire hazard. Close supporting fire's artillery, naval shells, airstrikes were essential but lethal when rounds fell short. Because flamethrower teams worked within a few meters of enemy positions, they lived constantly in the danger zone of their own side's weapons. Tragically, the danger was not merely theoretical. On March 3rd, Corporal Edgar O. Anthony of Company Y, 3rd Battalion, 20th Marines, 5th Marine Division, strode forward carrying his flamethrower when a sniper's bullet struck his fuel tanks. The puncture opened a catastrophic leak. Moments later, an igniter sparked. Anthony was engulfed and burned to death before his squad. Identification proved impossible in the field, his remains so altered that he was listed missing in action until dental records later gave him a name and a grave at Manila American Cemetery. He would have turned 23 in April. He never left Iwo. Faced with such losses, commanders sought technological answers. If a man made the operator too vulnerable, could a machine take his place? Enter the flamethrower tank an armored attempt to marry protection with destructive flame. The M4A3R3 Zippo was a Sherman tank modified to mount a large-capacity flamethrower in place of its main gun. Meanwhile, Navy construction battalions, the Seabees working at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii under Colonel Unmacht, developed the CBH-1 and the improved CBH-2 flamethrower systems, designs intended to be fitted to Sherman tanks and reduce the human cost of delivering liquid fire. Even with machines to shoulder the inferno, the memory of men like Rybakiewicz and of those who never returned remained. What would you have done in their boots, with ash between your teeth and the knowledge that every burst might be your last? Mechanized flamethrowers brought a terrifying new dimension to the battle. Operating at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure, these armored monsters could project fire nearly 400 feet far beyond the reach of man-portable M2s. Protected by thick tank armor, crews could shrug off small arms fire and most artillery fragments. Their fuel capacity dwarfed that of the backpack units, 300 gallons versus 4, allowing sustained fire that could melt bunkers, cave systems, and pillboxes alike. They could maneuver under fire, unleash torrents of napalm, and, most crucially, shield human operators from the immediate mortal danger that had haunted every footstep of the infantry's portable flame-bearers. 8 of these tanks, nicknamed Zippos, landed on Iwo Jima, with the first waves on D-Day, February 19, 1945. Initially, commanders hesitated to deploy them, uncertain whether these mechanized infernos would live up to their promise. Once committed, however, the tanks proved devastating. They could approach pillboxes and cave entrances that would have been suicide for any man. Hundreds of gallons of fire poured into the openings, consuming defenders and leaving psychological scars just as deep as the physical destruction. Marine commanders repeatedly cited the flamethrower tanks as the single most effective weapon used on Iwo Jima. Captain Frank C. Caldwell, commanding Company C-26 Marines, later stated that, in his view, it was the flame tanks, more than artillery or air support, that won the battle. Yet terrain imposed limits. Iwo Jima's steep slopes, narrow ravines, and obstructed gullies restricted tank movement. Many caves and pillboxes, especially those tucked into reverse slopes or perched in defilade, could only be engaged on foot. Tanks could not replace the human operators wielding portable M2 flamethrowers. These men remained indispensable and mortal. By the time the island was secured on March 26, 1945, after 36 days of unrelenting combat, the casualty statistics were staggering. Marine losses totaled roughly 24,000, including nearly 7,000 killed, died of wounds, or missing in action. One Marine or corpsman out of every 3 who landed became a casualty. It was the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history, surpassing Tarawa, Saipan, or Guam, and the only Pacific engagement in which American casualties exceeded Japanese losses. This grim tally testified to both Kuribayashi's defensive genius and his ruthless willingness to sacrifice every man under his command to inflict maximum losses. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The remainder perished, many incinerated by flamethrowers, others buried in collapsed tunnels, and countless others slain in the final desperate fighting. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was believed killed during a last counterattack on March 26th, though his body was never conclusively identified. His strategy, defense in depth, attrition warfare, and refusal to waste men in banzai charges had worked precisely as intended. He made America bleed. The battle's valor was recognized with 27 Medals of Honor, more than any other engagement in U.S. history. 12 of these awards were for the elimination of enemy positions, the brutal close-quarters work where flamethrowers proved essential. Only 6 of those 12 recipients survived to receive their medals. Woody Williams was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Harry Truman in October 1945. He lived to be the last surviving World War II Medal of Honor recipient, passing in 2022 at age 98. For decades after the war, Williams struggled with post-traumatic stress, haunted by the faces of men he had killed, the screams of Japanese soldiers consumed by fire, and memories of comrades lost beside him. Only in 1962, after a profound religious renewal, did his nightmares cease. He spent the remainder of his life supporting veterans through the Herschel Woody Williams Medal of Honor Foundation, speaking openly about the costs of war. Joseph Rybakiewicz survived the battle, but carried both physical and psychological scars. The hand wounded by grenade shrapnel never fully healed. Even heavier were the mental burdens. He kept a photograph of a Japanese soldier's wife and children taken from a fallen enemy, along with the soldier's medical kit and bayonet reminders that troubled him for decades. Before his death, he asked his wife to attempt returning these items to Japanese authorities, a futile effort to reconcile the moral weight of his actions. The reality of the flamethrower was uncompromising. In the caves and bunkers, particularly near the end when defenders were desperate and out of ammunition, operators could not discriminate. Civilians pressed into servicewomen, the elderly, even children, were as exposed to the searing fire as combatants. The 92% casualty rate of flamethrower operators in a single battalion on Iwo Jima remains perhaps the highest for any specialized American military unit in history. It is a testament to the courage of men who carried fire into battle, knowing that survival was never guaranteed and that their weapon, for all its deadly power, demanded the ultimate price from those who wielded it. To grasp the staggering risk flamethrower operators faced, consider the contrast. Rifle platoons endured roughly 33% casualties over the entire battle. Artillery units, safely positioned behind the front lines, suffered far lower losses. Even tank crews, despite their exposure to Japanese anti-tank weapons, experienced casualty rates lower than infantrymen. Flamethrower operators alone approached near certainty of death or serious injury. The oft-quoted 4-minute average combat lifespan, though debated by historians for its methodology, captured a grim reality the men themselves knew instinctively. Each engagement was a roll of dice, heavily weighted against survival. This naturally prompts a question: why volunteer? Why would any Marine willingly step into such near-certain peril? The answers were as varied as the men themselves. Some, like Joseph Rybakiewicz, were driven by patriotism and idealism, unaware of the true danger until they reached flamethrower school. Others were chosen for their physical attributes. Size, strength, and endurance were essential to bear the 70-pound backpack in addition to standard combat gear. Corporal Womack, described by his comrades as big and husky, became a linchpin in his unit simply because he could haul the weapon into combat when others could not. Still, others volunteered out of tactical insight and responsibility. Marines who witnessed friends fall attacking pillboxes without sufficient support understood that flamethrowers, horrifying as they were, saved lives by neutralizing positions that would otherwise have slaughtered entire squads. Unit cohesion and duty to comrades compelled men to pick up the weapon again and again. Private First Class Rudy Ortiz, whose Medal of Honor citation noted he had no prior flamethrower experience, repeatedly stepped forward after 2 trained operators were incapacitated. Under murderous fire, Ortiz carried the weapon multiple times, helping destroy 10 Japanese pillboxes before being killed on March 1st while attempting to extract his company. Ortiz was neither trained nor assigned. He volunteered because his Marines needed him. The strategic value of Iwo Jima itself remains a subject of debate. Officially, the battle was justified as eliminating the Japanese early warning system, reducing fighter harassment of B-29s, and establishing emergency landing fields. Post-war analysis suggested that over 2,200 B-29 bombers made emergency landings on Iwo, potentially saving 24,000 aircrew lives. Revisionist historians, such as Captain Robert Burrell, have argued that many landings were routine refueling stops rather than true emergencies. The Marines who endured the bloodshed had no voice in the planning, yet bore the consequences of these controversial calculations. What is indisputable is that the battle reshaped American military strategy. The horrific losses at Iwo Jima demonstrated that a mainland invasion of Japan would be unimaginably costly. Estimates for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, projected hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American casualties. The ferocity of Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima, where defenders fought virtually to the last man, foreshadowed what would have awaited troops on the main islands. Combined with the even bloodier Battle of Okinawa that followed, these lessons influenced President Harry Truman's decision to use atomic weapons. Paradoxically, the use of atomic bombs was judged to save lives by rendering an invasion unnecessary. preventing the catastrophic casualties that conventional assaults on Japan's home islands would have wrought. Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic speck in the Pacific, had left an indelible mark on strategy, on military thinking, and on the men who walked its ash-choked beaches, carrying fire itself. The courage of flamethrower operators facing almost certain death to protect their comrades and accomplish their mission stands as one of the most extraordinary and harrowing chapters in military history. For the flamethrower operators who survived, life after Iwo Jima was often as harrowing as the battle itself. The psychological trauma left deep, lingering scars. Woody Williams spoke of tucking memories into the recesses of his mind, acknowledging that taking a life leaves an indelible mark if one has any heart at all. Unlike riflemen, who could sometimes distance themselves from their victims, or artillery crews, who might never see the results of their fire, flamethrower operators witnessed the full, horrific consequences of their actions. They heard the screams, smelled burning flesh, and saw enemies thrash and fire until death offered release. The burden of inflicting such intimate death, even on enemies intent on killing you, was immense. Many operators, like Joseph Rybakiewicz, kept souvenirs from the dead, artifacts that haunted them for decades. A photograph of a Japanese soldier's wife and children served as a particularly cruel reminder that each person consumed by a flame had a life, a family, a story. Caves and pillboxes added moral ambiguity. Operators could never be certain who was inside. Japanese troops, yes, but also coerced laborers, Okinawan civilians, anyone seeking shelter. The flamethrower could not discriminate. Though post-traumatic stress disorder would not be formally recognized for years, it affected these men disproportionately. Extended combat exposure, the intimate nature of flamethrower killing, survivors' guilt over fallen comrades, and the moral weight of their actions combined to produce nightmares, depression, substance abuse, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life. Many did not speak of their experiences for decades, and when they did, the memories remained vivid and painful. The legacy of Iwo Jima reshaped Marine Corps doctrine. The battle validated combined arms operations, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support. It highlighted the critical importance of specialized weapons, particularly flamethrowers, in reducing fortified positions. Kuribayashi's defensive genius influenced not only Japanese military thinking, but also American appreciation for how determined defenders could exact devastating costs, even in hopeless situations. Lessons from Iwo Jima informed military planning from the Cold War through modern counterinsurgency operations. The Marine Corps War Memorial, dedicated in 1954 near Arlington National Cemetery, immortalizes Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the flag raising atop Mount Suribachi. It symbolizes Marine courage and sacrifice. Yet 3 of the 6 men depicted, Franklin Sousley, Harlan Block, and Michael Strank, died on Iwo Jima. The monument honors all Marines, but its resonance is especially profound for those who fought on the island. At the dedication of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Division cemeteries on Iwo Jima in March 1945, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz proclaimed that, among the men who fought on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. That valor was most starkly demonstrated by flamethrower operators who advanced into almost certain death to protect their comrades and accomplish the mission. They understood the statistics. A 92% casualty rate meant survival was unlikely. Yet they picked up their 70-pound flamethrowers with 7 seconds of burn time and a 20-meter effective range, and advanced anyway, because the mission demanded it, because brothers needed them, because someone had to. These weapons were simultaneously the Marines' most effective tool against Japanese fortifications and the most perilous assignment in Marine Corps history. Operators paid the ultimate price. Survivors carried physical and psychological scars for life. Many who died were unidentifiable, burned beyond recognition, buried in mass graves, or listed as missing in action. Today, Iwo Jima, officially Iwoto in Japanese, is under Japanese control, lightly inhabited and primarily a self-defense base, off-limits to casual visitors. The tunnels and fortifications remain slowly crumbling but still visible, while the beaches are unchanged, still dark with volcanic ash. Each year, veterans who can still make the journey return to stand on the same shores and before the memorials, remembering those who fell. Woody Williams made dozens of trips to the island, meeting Japanese veterans in reunions of honor where former enemies reflected on courage, sacrifice, and the costs of war. The Flamethrower operators of Iwo Jima were ordinary Americans, volunteers and draftees, farm boys and city kids, college students and factory workers, thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They trained for weeks to master a weapon that could likely kill them, advancing under fire with 70 pounds of fuel and explosives on their backs, marked by brilliant orange flame, to neutralize positions threatening their comrades. In one battalion, not a percent became casualties. Their story exposes the brutal calculus of specialized warfare. The military recognized the risks. The operators understood them. Yet the weapon was so effective, so vital to the mission, that the cost was deemed necessary. Some lives spent to save others, individual sacrifice serving larger objectives, human courage meeting the unforgiving mathematics of war. The numbers are stark. 7,000 Americans killed, 20,000 wounded, 21,000 Japanese killed. On an 8-square-mile volcanic island, more than 27,000 Americans were casualties, and nearly all Japanese defenders were killed. Among the Americans, flamethrower operators bore the heaviest proportional losses of any unit, epitomizing both the horror and heroism of Iwo Jima. They were the very tip of the spear, the soldiers placed in the most exposed, perilous positions on the most merciless battlefield in Marine Corps history. Nearly 8 decades later, as the last veterans of Iwo Jima pass from living memory, their legacy endures. The Marine Corps War Memorial rises in Arlington, its stone engraved with the names of the fallen. Medal of Honor citations recount acts of extraordinary heroism, but behind every citation, every memorial, every statistic were real human beings. Young men who carried fire into battle, men who perished at rates that stagger the imagination. They volunteered or were assigned to the deadliest duties imaginable and fulfilled them, even when doing so meant certain risk of death. The straightforward answer to why 92% of flamethrower operators became casualties is rooted in their weapon. The M2 flamethrower, devastating against fortified positions, demanded that its operator expose himself fully at close range to positions defended by resolute enemies, who instantly recognized him as a priority target and concentrated fire accordingly. The statistics are cruel, but the deeper truth lies in human will and character. Joseph Rybakiewicz returned to combat after receiving treatment for his wounded hand. Woody Williams crawled forward 5 separate times to reload and re-engage pillboxes. Rudy Ortiz, untrained in flamethrower operations, repeatedly volunteered when trained operators fell. Their motivation was not tactical doctrine or strategic necessity alone. It was the bonds between Marines, the refusal to let comrades die when there was a chance to save them, the recognition that duties sometimes demand self-sacrifice, and the courage to act even when action almost certainly meant death. These men were not reckless. They were fully aware of the mortal danger they faced, yet they advanced anyway. This was not ignorance or folly. It was courage in its purest form, the conscious acceptance of almost certain peril for a purpose larger than oneself. The 92% casualty rate among flamethrower operators on Iwo Jima is more than a statistic. It is a testament to that courage and the price it exacted. They stepped into fire, many knowing they might never emerge, and they did it anyway. That is why they became casualties, and that is why they are forever remembered.